for doing this in such short notice. It's great that so many expert voices have come together in terms of trying to make some changes and maybe do some kind of roadmap in terms of how we're going to go forward. But before I introduce everyone, I'd like to acknowledge the untimely death of Mr. Mohammed Hussein from Sweden. The meeting would like to extend the condolences to Mr. Hussein's family, and that may he rest in peace. So we're very, very sorry to hear of his untimely death. Now, I would like to introduce the people who are going to present today, and I will start with Kyaw. And please excuse me if my pronunciation is incorrect. So Kyaw is there, chairman of the ERC and a Rohingya medical doctor. He completed his medical studies from the university in Magjawa, correct? And practiced medicine in Yangon before moving to Europe. And Kyaw currently resides in London and was, of course, born in Myanmar in his ancestral land of Arakan, okay? Michael Becker, I think goes as Mike, am I right, Mike? Is an adjunct assistant professor at Trinity College Dublin, where he lectures on public international law, a graduate of Amherst College and Yale Law School in the United States, and is presently completing his doctorate at the University of Cambridge on the subject of international commissions of inquiry and fact-finding missions, which is especially relevant, of course, today. Plus, he has also spent 4 years as associate legal officer at the ICJ and has written extensively about the court. Mike is also a resident of County Carlow. This is useless information, by the way. So he's practically a neighbor to myself, but also to the Rohingya living in Carlow. Okay. Then Phil comes. Phil is there. Hi, Phil. You're welcome. He hails from Boston and is currently living in Bangkok. He is Deputy Director of Human Rights Works Asia Division with a particular focus on Southeast Asia. Phil is a strategic campaigner on human rights causes and cases and an author on human rights, labor rights, refugees, and migration. Phil also works extensively on human rights, labor rights, protection of migrant workers, and counter human trafficking efforts, and oversaw the successful negotiation of the first regional intergovernmental agreement on human trafficking, and is on the Greater McCain sub-region, and he is a graduate of Johns Hopkins School and Advanced International Studies. You are welcome, Phil. Okay. Azeem, there is Azeem smiling. Azeem Ibrahim. Hi, Azeem, you're welcome. He's a scholar on genocide who has visited Rakhine State on several occasions. He has published and written extensively on Rohingya genocide and has exposed the culpability of the Buddhist clergy in the religious cleansing of Myanmar. Ibrahim has a PhD from University of Cambridge and has been a research fellow with the International Security Program at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard, a World Fellow at Yale, fellow and member of the Board of Directors at the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding. Azeem will address the question on the international community and the fight for justice and the protection of victims of genocide. Okay, Azeem. So then we have Bob from Canada, Bob Ray, the Honourable Bob Ray, a long-time campaigner for the Rohingya and Canada's Special Envoy to Myanmar and Senior Fellow at Raoul Wallenberg Centre for Human Rights. Bob has also been appointed as the Canadian Prime Minister's issues on both Rohingya, on refugee and humanitarian issues, including the Rohingya crisis. Bob's record on social justice and human rights issues dates back to the 1970s and has been active since the 1970s, and Bob now lives in Toronto. Am I right there, Bob? Yeah. So Ambia, there is Ambia. You're welcome, Ambia. Co-founder of the ERC and vice chairman of the ERC and co-founder of Rohingya Medics, a humanitarian, a pediatrician, a psychiatrist, a trauma and PTSD therapist, born in Myanmar and now lives in Germany. Ambia has also worked with Rohingya women and is a long-time campaigner for the empowerment of Rohingya girls and women. You're welcome, Ambia. Just before we start, I just need some housekeeping on this. I have my bicycle bell, okay? Can you hear it?
Yes.
So I'm going to ring that if people are really going over, but I think we're just going to have to be a little bit flexible on the time. And then just one other thing, there is a slight change at the end here. Questions and answers were to come after closing remarks, but now we are going to have, and I think Heikel was in touch with you, Ambia. We're now going to have questions and answers, and then Ambia, you're going to provide closing remarks. Yeah, so that's good. And just going through my notes here. I just want to give a little bit, just a 2-minute maybe background for our audience, really, because we all know what's been happening. But for those listening in or joining us on streaming or whatever on Facebook, so everyone is welcome. We're delighted to have you watch and to listen and to contribute later. So earlier this year, January 2020, the ICJ issued an order on the Gambia's request, ordering Myanmar to prevent genocidal acts against Rohingya Muslims. It was an important ruling by the ICJ, as it represented the first step towards ensuring that the Rohingya victims get some tangible justice. This conference, organized by the European Rohingya Council, addresses that ruling and asks the questions when and if the Rohingya can expect justice from the ruling of the ICJ. The conference will also include input on the role of international communities in seeking justice and also the role of human rights organizations. We are acutely aware that during pandemics, and this is throughout history, it is the weakest, the frailest, the dispossessed, the marginalized, and the destitute that suffer the greatest. And of course, the Rohingya have been described as the most persecuted, one of the most persecuted groups in the world. And it is really them that we are trying to address today. And I am going to scream if anyone says to me again that we are all in the same boat. We clearly are not in the same boat. Some people have little paddles with holes in the plastic and are desperately trying to stay afloat, while others have huge, huge ships, which they can, obviously survive very well on, and this is hardly making an impact. So I think we just need to acknowledge that we're all in different places, but certainly the most marginalized and the most destitute are going to be the worst hit of all, as it has been evidenced throughout history. So I'm going to hand you over now to Kyaw, and he is going to bring us through the opening remarks. Thank you, everyone, and you're welcome.
Thank you so much for such amazing introduction. First of all, I want to begin with good afternoon, and in some part, good morning to dear honorable speakers, moderator, technical expert, and those who are watching online. We wish and pray for you and your family to be safe from the COVID-19. My name is Kyaw, as introduced by Stephanie. I'm also known as Khubab in our community. I am the chairman of the European Rohingya Council. On behalf of European Rohingya Council and our Rohingya community, I would like to thank all of you for your time and contribution in our fight for justice and safe return to our ancestral land, where we are going to rebuild our community, and we hope to live side by side with our fellow citizens. Your contributions are well known to the members of our Rohingya community. Without the supports of our friends like you, our community will not be able to imagine justice for the genocide against our people by Myanmar armed forces. On 23rd January 2020, when International Court of Justice issued an order of provisional measures, the light of hope for justice and safe and dignified return to the ancestral land was shining in every face of the members of Rohingya community. While we are waiting for the final justice from ICJ and international community, our people were expecting that Myanmar government would ease all of the genocidal measures imposed on our community and gradually start the process of safe and dignified return. On the contrary, Myanmar government has increased genocidal measures on our community, such as killing of the members of our community, restricting all basic human rights, and creating conditions that force our people to leave the homeland. On 22nd May 2020, Myanmar has submitted its first report to the ICJ. Myanmar's request to keep the report confidential has cast a shadow of despair and a sense of injustice, as our people are not aware of what is being reported. In addition to that, as the world is facing costly burdens of the COVID-19 pandemic, the issues of Rohingyas plight fade away at the global stage, and the Rohingya community itself feels their plight and quest for justice are forgotten. Today, in this first ever virtual conference, our Rohingya community are waiting to hear from our honorable speakers about the ICJ and the direction of our plight. I hope at the end of this conference, we will get a message. We will get message on how the direction of our cause is going and how can we achieve ultimate goal. The goal is the justice and safe and dignified return to our ancestral land. Thank you for, thank again for all of your participation and contribution. We hope at the end of this conference, we will achieve what we are looking for. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lajo. And I have also first to apologize for me going over, but you went under, so we're back on track. That's really good. Like you, I would like at the end of this to have some kind of roadmap in terms of giving some hope, just a little bit of hope that we are watching and we are trying to do something in terms of, you know, making the lives a little bit hopeful. That's all. If we can offer a little bit of hope, I think that's all we can do. So, but if we could do by the end of this conference, you know, have some kind of roadmap for each of us, that we have something to do, that we can go out and do something. Let's hope for that. At least let's hope for that. I'm now going to welcome in. It is Mike Becker. You there, Mike?
Yes, I'm here.
Hi, Mike. Is it Michael or Mike? Which would you prefer?
We can go with Mike.
Okay, Mike, great. So Mike, you're here now at 2:15. So you know what your remit is. So it's, can the ICJ ensure Rohingya justice to Rohingya? If yes, how soon Rohingya can expect justice from the ICJ? And of course, you have extensive experience working with the ICJ. So you above all will know how slow or how, you know, how really unwieldy this whole process is. So we're looking forward to hearing from you. Thanks, Mike.
Right, I'll get to that for sure. Well, thank you so much to the European Rohingya Council for inviting me, for the organizers, for Stephanie for your introduction. It's really great, I think, that we're able to keep these conversations about this situation going on when so many of us also have our attention focused in other places right now on matters of great concern. And it's a real honor for me to be able to sit here on this virtual panel with people who have dedicated so much of their time and lives and expertise to the situation in Myanmar and the situation of the Rohingya. So as Stephanie said, the specific question I've been asked is, can the ICJ case ensure justice for the Rohingya, and if so, when? Well, that's not an easy question to answer, in part because different people may have very different ideas about what justice actually is going to mean in this case. It may fundamentally mean the opportunity for the Rohingya who've been forced out of Myanmar to have a safe and dignified return to their homes, but it can mean lots of other things too. And so I think over the course of the event today, maybe we will get a better sense of the range of ideas of what justice actually requires could be. I'm going to set that aside for now and give you my short answer to the question before I give you my much longer answer to the question. The ICJ case can be an important part of achieving justice for the Rohingya, whatever justice might mean. But on its own, the ICJ case cannot in itself ensure justice. And so to answer that, to explain that answer in more detail, I want to talk about three things. I mainly want to talk about the Provisional Measures Order from January and Myanmar's compliance reports. Secondly, I'd like to say something briefly about one of the big challenges that the Gambia is going to face in the main case. And then finally, to wrap up, what these limitations of the ICJ case might mean going forward. I do want to preface my remarks, as Stephanie said in the introduction. I come at this from the perspective of an international lawyer and from the perspective of someone who has spent 4 years working inside the International Court of Justice. And I think that that means that my take on some of these issues might be slightly different from people coming at it from different vantage points or different, working in different environments. But I hope that that can all be constructive. Okay, so as we've already heard back in January, as all of you know, and many of our listeners or watchers know, the court acted on the Gambia's request for provisional measures. And provisional measures are a type of emergency relief that are put in place and are meant to preserve the situation that is the subject of the litigation while the case is being heard. Okay, and that's important because, as has already been suggested, an ICJ case can take a substantial amount of time. So I'll answer the when question now. The length of time that ICJ cases is largely attributable to the amount of time that the court grants to the parties to prepare their written submissions. So that means the legal arguments that the states involved in the case have to put together, as well as all of the documentary evidence that supports those legal arguments. And there are normally 2 rounds of these submissions of written arguments, and that takes a lot of time. My best prediction is that we can expect a decision on the merits, so a decision by the ICJ on whether Myanmar has breached its obligations under the 1948 Genocide Convention in 4 to 5 years from when Gambia filed the case. And I think in the best case, we can expect that judgment to come in the second half of 2023. That takes into account the high likelihood that Myanmar is going to raise challenges to the court's jurisdiction in the next phase. They have every right to do so. I am fully confident that those objections will fail. They've already raised them at the provisional measures phase, and the court neatly dismantled them, but they can raise them again, and that adds a bit of time. It's also possible that even when we get to this judgment on the merits, hopefully in 2023, the court might decide to separate out the question of relief, or what's the remedy if the Gambia prevails. And so that could lead to another follow-on proceeding that could add yet a bit more time. So I know that this may seem discouraging. I don't think, however, as some have maybe said in recent days, we're not looking at a situation where this case is going to take 10 plus years to be resolved. It's unfortunate that the court's previous genocide convention cases, these were the cases brought by Bosnia and Croatia against Serbia in the 1990s, those cases did take more than 10 years. But the reasons for that are specific to those cases and do not pertain here. So I don't think we're looking at something like that. Okay, so we know it will take some years before the ICJ can get to a final judgment on the claims in the case, but we also know that the Rohingya face real and serious risks and dangers right now. And so that's why, at Gambia's request, the court has granted these provisional measures that require Myanmar to take all measures within its power to prevent acts that would fall within the scope of Article 2 of the Genocide Convention. So just to repeat those now, that means Myanmar has been ordered to prevent the intentional killings of members of the Rohingya group, to prevent other types of serious bodily harm or mental harm directed at the group's destruction, to prevent the deliberate infliction of conditions of life calculated to bring about the group's destruction, and to prevent measures that might prevent births within the group. So that's the language straight from Article 2 of the Genocide Convention. And on paper, I think this looks like a very strong statement by the court, but there are some problems with it too. For one, the court did not take up Gambia's very smart suggestion that it not simply reiterate Myanmar's existing obligations under the Genocide Convention, but that it specify types of actions that could presumptively be potential acts of genocide. So not only acts of mass violence directed against the Rohingya, but specific types of crimes like the destruction of villages or the deprivation of food or essential medicines. Instead, the court didn't do that. It just restated the language of Article 2 of the Convention. And the problem with this is that it can lead to disagreement or confusion about what the provisional measures actually require. In terms of the rest of the court's order in January, it also ordered Myanmar to take measures to prevent the destruction of evidence, to preserve evidence relating to the claims in the case, and for Myanmar to file these periodic reports with the court about what it's doing to comply with the court's order. And so we know Myanmar has filed its first report on time on May 23rd. And I know that there's disappointment, and that we've heard today there's disappointment or frustration that that report is, for now at least, non-public. Gambia has the report. Gambia can now respond to Myanmar's report and put that information in front of the ICJ. And we don't yet know if the court will then decide to make these reports public. So I want to say something here about that idea of potential confusion about what the provisional measures actually require. And I think this is quite important. There was a lot of commentary in the days leading up to the May 23rd deadline and since, including from some of the groups who are doing great work, who are associated with some of my fellow panelists today. And those reports and commentaries tended to suggest that Myanmar is in total non-compliance with the court's provisional measures order. I don't think that that is quite the right assessment, and it maybe reflects unrealistic expectations, or maybe a misunderstanding or a different understanding, at least than my own, of what the function of provisional measures really are. I think one way to think about provisional measures is that they are like a temporary dam. They are something that you put in place to prevent the worst from happening while you take the time to get at the source of the problem, or while you take the time to build a permanent, stronger dam. So to my mind, the court's January order was focused on preventing the absolute worst from happening. I think it can be read as a very strong direction to Myanmar that Myanmar absolutely must prevent the types of mass violence, a recurrence of what we saw in October 2016 or August 2017. So mass killings of Rohingya, organized brutality, torture, wide-scale sexual violence, and so forth. At a minimum, that is what the court's order, what the provisional measures are meant to prevent from happening. And by that measure, which may seem like a very, very low bar, Myanmar is arguably complying. And so that's why I take some issue with the idea that the provisional measures have in effect been a failure. I don't think that's quite right. I think it's problematic to take the position that the provisional measures require right now Myanmar to be taking active steps to dismantle this whole system that they have in place, a system of discrimination, persecution, oppression directed at the Rohingya. But I want to be very careful about explaining why. Whether all of those discriminatory institutions and structures, whether the denial to the Rohingya of rights of citizenship, the franchise, other basic human rights constitute genocide or are evidence of genocidal intent, those are core issues in the case in front of the ICJ. And those are questions that the court has not decided yet. It's very important to understand that the provisional measures decision was not a finding that genocide has taken place already in the past. What it was, and this is very important, it was an important finding that the Rohingya who remain in Myanmar are extremely vulnerable, and that there is a genuine risk of genocide taking place going forward. But the court's order wasn't, in my view, despite its very broad wording, and all of this is a problem of the court's own making in some ways. Despite that very broad wording, all measures within its power, I don't see that as requiring Myanmar right now to take actions that would in effect be prejudging some aspects of the case. It would be great to see Myanmar do those things, but I don't see their failure to do them necessarily as the same as non-compliance. Now, I want to be absolutely clear, this doesn't mean I think Myanmar is in perfect compliance with the court's order either, simply because it hasn't engaged in further waves of mass atrocity. And I'll just give some examples of things that I think are problematic and that I think the Gambia perhaps should be pressing the court and Myanmar on. So for example, the ongoing treatment of Rohingya in the detention camps inside of Myanmar deserves attention, especially if COVID-19 has led to new forms of discriminatory treatment or persecution or sort of a willful neglect of the Rohingya populations there. And those are new facts that the court couldn't possibly have had in mind back in December and January. That's something that's important to look at. I think things like the internet blackout that's been imposed in Rakhine State for much of this period of time over much of the territory is problematic because it hinders the preservation of evidence in the main case. I'd say the same about the government's apparently changing position on whether non-Rohingya who have taken over or moved into Rohingya homes and villages should be allowed to stay there, because that could be destroying evidence in the main case too. And I also think things like the current travel restrictions on Rohingya within Myanmar, and especially the reports that we get about criminal prosecution of Rohingya who are attempting to leave the country, might be in violation of the Provisional Measures Order. I don't necessarily think when we see reports about Rohingya casualties in connection with the ongoing armed conflict between the government and the Arakan army are clear examples of non-compliance. I think that's more of a gray area and would have to be looked at on a kind of a case-by-case basis. So I think Gambia and its legal team have a real choice to make here about how much they want to focus on trying to use the provisional measures mechanism as a means to provide material relief to the Rohingya inside Myanmar right now. That's a choice that they have to make, because Gambia can go back to the court at any time to seek a modification of the provisional measures, to seek new protections in effect. And this, I think, is where civil society has a really important role to play, because NGOs on the ground, whether inside Myanmar or operating outside Myanmar, given all the restrictions, can play a really important role in gathering information and giving the Gambia and its legal team more information to act upon if they do want to seek further provisional measures in the case. And this is also a reason, a really key reason, why the compliance reports, in my view, should be made public, and Gambia's responses for that matter. It's unfortunate back in December that the Gambia, when it asked for this reporting requirement, didn't ask that it be public reporting. It's important to realize maybe that in the relatively few cases in the past where the court has ordered states to do these kinds of interim reports on provisional measures, those haven't been public either. So this isn't anything new. But in this particular case, it absolutely makes sense for the reports to be made public. I think it would better serve the purposes underlying the imposition of the reporting requirement in the first place, which is to put Myanmar's conduct under continuing scrutiny while this case is being heard. So I think it rests with Gambia primarily to make the case to the ICJ that these reports should be public. Now, the ICJ has no formal channel for civil society groups, NGOs to participate, unlike some other international courts. But I do wonder whether it would be worth considering in this case, interested NGOs or Rohingya groups to perhaps consider writing to the court, even informally, to make the case for how important it is to have these reports be made public. I'll address my other 2 points much more briefly here, mindful of the time. When it comes to the main case, because if we're going to see the ICJ case achieve justice for the Rohingya, it comes down to prevailing on the merits in the main case too. I think there is reason for measured optimism. There's no question that mass atrocities have occurred here, but as many of my co-panelists will know, even when there is abundant evidence of violence and cruelty, the task of actually proving genocide and genocidal intent in front of a court, and that includes proving this intent to destroy the protected group in whole or in part, is very steep. And this stems in part from the way that the ICJ's case law has developed. It means that if you're going to prove genocide by inference, so you're going to prove genocidal intent, that the intention was to destroy the group based on a pattern of conduct, various disparate acts that can be linked together, plus government policies and practices. That inference of genocidal intent has to be the only conclusion that can reasonably be drawn from the evidence. And this means that if the state accused of genocide can show that its actions, even if they involve mass violence and maybe international crimes, were motivated by some other policy, that can defeat the genocide claim. And this gives states like Myanmar a lot of room to maneuver, because they can claim that they were engaged in counterterrorism or putting down an insurrection or some other non-genocidal, had some other non-genocidal goal. And we already know that these are the types of arguments that Myanmar is planning to make. It's already been well previewed for us at the provisional measures hearing in December. And that this steep test that the court has adopted is part of why Bosnia's claims at the ICJ met only limited success and why Croatia's Genocide Convention claims were rejected. There are a lot of people, maybe some of them are sitting here with me today, who think the court's case law on this is simply wrong, that its interpretation of the Genocide Convention and its development of this inference test is misguided, and that the court has kind of painted itself into a corner that makes it practically impossible to ever uphold a claim of genocide. I am sympathetic to those arguments, but I do not think making those arguments is going to help Gambia win this case. Instead, I think it's absolutely crucial for the Gambia and its legal team to work within the court's established case law to show why, in the case of the Rohingya, the facts and the evidence can actually meet this very strict test that the court has adopted. So this means showing the court, explaining to the court why the arguments that Serbia made to defeat the claims in the Bosnia and Croatia cases simply don't apply here, and why Myanmar's efforts to point to other explanations for its conduct simply don't hold water. It means showing the court exactly how it can apply its test, not abandon the test, but how it can apply the test, and indeed how it can even apply the approach advocated by Myanmar's lead counsel, William Chavez, in his scholarship. How the court can apply that approach, and Gambia and the Rohingya can still prevail based on the facts and evidence here. So am I sure that the Gambia will succeed? No, they might not, and it's really important to be prepared for that possibility. But I don't think that this case is a fool's errand. Now, even if Gambia wins the case, it's not entirely clear what type of remedy or relief the court might order. And then there's the separate big question of actually how do you get Myanmar to comply? How do you enforce that order? Those are big challenges too. So I'll just wind up here, as I know my time is up. As I said at the start, the ICJ case can be an important part of achieving justice for the Rohingya, but it can't do it on its own. I think it's important to see ICJ litigation as part of a broader, multi-step process. Sometimes an ICJ judgment can be the end of a dispute, truly. But in most cases, it's one point along kind of a continuum of dispute settlement, and follow through on the court's decision, if Gambia prevails, is going to require a lot of other action, a lot of other actors, states, international organizations, and civil society for it to succeed. I do think the ICJ case can be a useful and powerful focal point for developing this broader strategy that's needed to put pressure on Myanmar to make the types of changes that are needed. I think the ICJ case has already raised the visibility of the plight of the Rohingya in important ways, and I'd like to think it's prevented even worse potential outcomes. But it can't on its own solve the entirety of the problems that the Rohingya face. So I look forward to hearing what everyone else has to say today and how their views might help us to think about how the ICJ case can be part of this broader strategy aimed at achieving justice, however the Rohingya might define it. Thank you very much for allowing me to participate today.
Thank you very much, Mike. Very interesting contribution there, particularly in light of COVID-19 and willful neglect. So obviously Myanmar have in their lap more ways to discriminate and oppress because of COVID-19. And just one thing I'd mention there too, you know, one of the outcomes of your presentation there, you suggested that maybe civil society organizations and Rohingya groups could write to the ICJ in terms of trying to get an avenue for some representation for civil society organizations. So I think that could be one of the outcomes from today, at least some movement on that. So that's, and you obviously said a lot more in terms of the Gambia as well and who's supporting the Gambia, but maybe that's something we could cover in some of the questions and answers later. There is something has come in there on the chat about the volume being low. So Ibrahim, is there anything you can do about turning up the volume? I presume that's something that people should do on their own computers, is turn up the volume. We probably don't have, can't do much at this end.
Yes, everyone a little bit speak loudly, maybe it will fix, because I don't have anything here to load. I cannot do anything.
No, so maybe for those listening in, or those you know, who are on Facebook, maybe if you could look at your own volume, probably down at the right hand side of your computers or your devices, and just turn up the volume there, so you should hear us more clearly. I've just done that here. So so now we're sticking to time, which is great. So congratulations and well done, everybody. So over to Phil now. Phil, your question is, in which way human rights organizations such as yours, Human Rights Watch, are assisting the Rohingya community in seeking justice? So that's almost an accountable question, which is a difficult one. So go ahead, Phil. Thank you.
Thank you for that introduction, Professor McDermott, and thank you also to Dr. Kyaw and everyone at the ERC for inviting me to participate in this important online conference. It's a privilege to be invited to speak on such a distinguished panel. The organizers of the conference have asked me to respond to that question, which is actually, if you look at it from the perspective of what we're doing as an NGO, it's a very broad question. Obviously, we have an international justice division that's working on the ICJ issues and others, but as an overall organization, we're doing issues related to research, to advocacy, and to also exposure, to continue to try to keep the Rohingya situation in the spotlight, which is more and more difficult because, of course, other stories like COVID-19 and now, of course, Black Lives Matter and the protests in the United States, stealing the media spotlight away from anything else, whether it be the Rohingya or other important news stories on the international stage. I would say that, the Rohingya people, of course, have been forced to really walk a harsh rights abusing path. And I actually count back to June 2012. I don't need to tell you all about what happened in June and October 2012 or October 2016 or finally in August 2017. But there's historical precedents of ethnic cleansing and mass exodus going back even to 78 in 1991 and 1992. And, it's always been a hard and unjust situation for the Rohingya, dating way back to dictator Ne Win's time. And anecdotally, I kind of recognize the challenge we face in terms of trying to get implementation of whatever the court comes up from. With an anecdote that when I went to Myanmar with my friend Matt Smith, who's now the executive director of Fortify Rights, he had written a report back in 2012 about the October 2012 violence. Actually, this is the report itself right here. It's All You Can Do Is Pray. And, talking about ethnic cleansing, crimes against humanity back to the October 2012 violence against the Rohingya and the Kaman Muslims in Rakhine State. And we, went to see the National League for Democracy Party. We tried to get a meeting with them. They were not even in power at that time, and they refused flat out to meet us. Finally, on the sly, the late newspaper man and the progressive NLD leader, Win Tin, agreed to see us at his house. And he told us that the NLD didn't want to know about the Rohingya. They didn't care about the Rohingya, and that he would likely be heavily criticized if it came out that he had agreed to talk to us. And sadly, it's still very much like that today, heading into a new election in November 2020. On that same trip, we also went to see the 88 generation, whose members Human Rights Watch had been regularly campaigning for to be released by the SBDC military regime. And they were finally released. They agreed to see us, really as a courtesy, because of course we had been campaigning on their behalf. And the senior leader of the 88 generation told me that, look, we have a problem with the title of your report. And I replied, well, why? I explained that, the name of the report, All You Can Do Is Pray, it came from a Rohingya man who told us that's what the security forces burning down his neighborhood responded to him when he pled for help, saying, well, all you can do is pray. And that's where the title came from. And the 88 generation leader turned to us, seriously turned to us, and he said, no. The problem is that you said that what happened in October was ethnic cleansing. And that cannot be, because the Rohingya are not an ethnic people of Burma. And, Matt and I looked at each other and we realized, all of a sudden the kind of challenge we face to get any sort of actual implementation of justice for the Rohingya inside today's Burma. That kind of comment coming from a supposed champion of democracy in Burma and human rights in Burma was really quite shocking. And since then, of course, it's only become worse, as you all know. I should say that Human Rights Watch is firmly committed, to ensuring all the Rohingya can voluntarily return to their homes in Rakhine State in safety and security. We aim for that to happen, with them be able to return with full freedom of movement, access to livelihoods, health, education, other services. And, we have been very clear that we demand the scrapping or the fundamental revision of the Citizenship Act of 1982 to bring it fully into line with international human rights standards, with the result that the Rohingya people will be recognized as full citizens of Burma. And that, we recognize the importance of having international agencies in Rakhine State who should be granted, in our view, unfettered access to Rohingya villages to monitor and report and provide humanitarian assistance where needed. We see that there are many organizations, large and small, international and Rohingya and Burmese in some cases, based in Asia, North America, Europe, who are significantly contributing to the effort to secure accountability and justice for the Rohingya. So, we're very proud to be working with many of those coalition partners. We recognize that this is a big team effort and that it's only going to succeed if we all actively collaborate and work together now and in the future. Our work, and what we're doing to try to bring justice to the Rohingya involves human rights research, exposing abuses, and demanding accountability and justice, primarily through advocacy, mostly with governments, but also in some cases with international justice mechanisms. What we do, we document rights abuses, we expose in the world, and we demand action. We pressure governments and UN agencies to live up to human rights standards, and we embarrass and expose those who don't. Often this involves in-depth reports with on-the-ground research and interviews. So one of the examples of that is another report that we put out, which was All of My Body Was Pain. This was released in November 2017. And that documented the sexual violence by the Tatmadaw and other Burmese security forces against Rohingya women during the clearance operations. This research involved a particularly skilled woman researcher who works on what we call emergency situation for our Women's Rights Division. And she has extensive previous experience in documenting sexual violence in conflict situations. And her work really put the whole issue of sexual violence in the center of the discussion of rights abuses by the Burmese security forces against the Rohingya. That was a direct contribution to the issue of accountability because we had to document it in a way that it was not something that could be questioned. And actually, if you want to see why the Burmese government's so-called International Commission of Inquiry falls short, just look at the ICOE's complete and total failure to document any cases of sexual violence. In some ways, no wonder the Myanmar government is too shy to release the full text of the ICOE report, although we are still advocating that they should. It's because, they've just missed massive parts of the problem. And it's shameful that we're still hearing diplomats in Yangon and from countries like Japan, the UK, and others who continue to hold out hope that the ICOE will amount to something. The reality is that's window dressing. This was put up to try to divert attention away from international accountability. And the fact that some states are still claiming the ICO report has some efficacy is still shocking to us. Another of our reports, Massacre by the River, is a report about the Tulatoli massacre. We released that in December 2017. And this is the report that has elicited very strong interest from accountability mechanisms like the ICJ, the ICC, and also the IIMM. In other times, our research has involved use of satellite photography to document mass destruction by security forces. We did that in October 2012, when the Myanmar government was claiming nothing was happening in Rakhine State, but then would not grant access. and again in October 2016. You know, a lot of times because the Myanmar government has sort of been on an improved learning curve. Back in 2012, it was still possible to get into parts of Rakhine State to do the kind of reporting that we did in the two reports we did about the violence in June 2012 and October 2012. By 2016, it was becoming more difficult, although at that time there was a group of Rohingya using cell phones who were able to document a lot of information. By the time it got to August 2017, what we saw was deliberate targeting of Rohingya with cell phones or smartphones being killed if a smartphone was found on them. The rapid pace of the destruction, the sweep of the clearance operations didn't allow what had happened previously, where Rohingya from some parts of some villages that were being attacked were fleeing to other villages nearby where they could safely shelter and then go back in and document what happened. And now, of course, we have the internet suspension over much of Rakhine State that is deliberately aimed at not allowing people to be able to report what the Burmese military is doing. So, this is just as we try to do more, I think we're also seeing the Burmese military becoming more and repressive and trying to control the narrative in a much more systematic way. So, I mean, our latest piece of research that's in the pipeline is a very comprehensive report about abuses being suffered by the Rohingya who are locked down in IDP camps in Rakhine State. We should be releasing that sometime in the coming months. I don't have a specific date yet, but it is in the process. And I'm sure actually that this kind of research will be very interesting to the Gambia and to the International Court of Justice, because they're going to be examining, as Mike mentioned, Myanmar's compliance or lack thereof with the court's provisional measures. And some of the issues that will be there will be, how are those Rohingya who are locked down in those IDP camps being treated? Now, what we realize also, of course, is that you can have the best report in the world. You can have the most amazing research, but if you don't get it out into the wider world for people to see it, then nothing will happen. And so that's why Human Rights Watch spends a lot of time talking to the media to encourage them to cover these stories, to dig deeper and investigate, and to pressure governments to answer inquiries about abuses. And a lot of times we're working behind the scenes with The Guardian or BBC or others, as they are also undertaking investigative reporting to look at what is happening in Rakhine State. And we're very dedicated to trying to get the story out via reports, press releases, photos, videos, multimedia, and of course, the satellite photography that we have been continually using as well. I mean, we're quite loud. We're a very loud NGO. We verify the facts, we make sure we have it right, and then we broadcast it to the world. And since many of our people are also former journalists themselves, we know how to get the right information in the right hands at the right time. We also know, in some cases, how to break story ourselves, as we just did with the case of the recent torture and abuses of the Rohingya who were sent by the Bangladesh authorities to the Basan Char, the de facto detention island, or the Rohingya Alcatraz, as I call it. So, I mean, I think you've seen us regularly quoted about Myanmar and the Rohingya and many other things. It's because we're working very hard to get the story out there and try to keep the Rohingya story and what is happening in the headlines as much as possible. On issues of accountability, I think that it's no surprise for you to hear that Human Rights Watch has a long-standing relationship with the leaders who now lead the government of the Gambia. It's partly because we worked long and hard with human rights and democracy advocates who opposed the Gambia's longtime dictator, Yahya Jammeh, who was forced into exile in January 2017 after holding power for over 22 years. And we were involved with those Gambians in extensively documenting President Yahya's abuses and advocating for him to be held accountable. So what we saw is that the struggle for rights in one part of the world inevitably affects another part of the world, but not often so directly as between the Gambia and Burma, as in this case. And we have a historically close relationship also with Abu Bakar Tambadou, who's the former prosecutor of the Rwanda genocide trials. And that's how we know him originally. And now, of course, is the AG of the Gambia. And so, you know, my colleagues, Reed Brody, Richard Dicker, Pam Singh, you know, are particularly engaged with the Gambia going forward and, you know, trying to answer questions and provide advice when we're asked for. You know, we work behind the scenes, you know, we're there. We have worked on these international accountability mechanisms for a long time. And in fact, we have an international justice division, which does nothing but that, working to advance justice and accountability through these mechanisms. So we've turned out to be a pretty good source of advice on both legal and political challenges facing attempts to hold state leaders accountable, having done this in many other countries. We are similarly, though, perhaps less closely involved in pushing for the International Criminal Court's prosecutor to press forward. And, you know, she sought the go-ahead from the court to investigate and hopefully eventually prosecute Myanmar for the crime of deportation of the Rohingya people to Bangladesh. And, you know, the court fortunately ruled very broadly that both deportation and persecution could be investigated and didn't actually bar the prosecutor from investigating other crimes against humanity as well. So again, we will work behind the scenes as needed to advocate for the strongest possible case to be brought. You know, sometimes that means talking privately. Sometimes that means, you know, raising public issues. But in any case, we are on the ball and trying to work through that. And finally, on the human rights accountability front, Human Rights Watch really had what I would call a whole of organization advocacy effort to persuade the member states of the UN Human Rights Council to follow up the UN fact-finding mission by setting up the independent investigative mechanism for Myanmar, or the IIMM, which is actually now starting the detailed work of identifying suspects and documenting cases for future prosecution by an international accountability mechanism. I think the fact that Myanmar is now under investigation by the ICJ and the ICC and the IIMM, it's not a coincidence. It's a product of many activists around the world working for days, months, and years to demand the Tatmadaw, the Border Patrol Police, the police, and the Rakhine auxiliaries be held accountable for what they've done to the Rohingya. You know, just the other day, we had a very long meeting with the British FCO in London, again, raising key issues about the Rohingya in both Rakhine State and in Bangladesh. Next week, we'll make another effort to bring the Japanese Ministry of Foreign Affairs around to stronger position. You know, it's very difficult. They're notoriously resistant to doing that, and the Japanese ambassador in Yangon is a disaster. You know, but we're going to continue to try at it, because if we actually are able to pull them away in some ways from Myanmar, it's very critical. I mean, it changes the dynamic in Geneva and other places. My colleagues in Washington are still pushing the State Department to go beyond calling what happened in August, September 2017 as ethnic cleansing. As you know, that whole determination, based on a very, very big piece of research that the State Department did, is sort of frozen. You know, they called it ethnic cleansing and stopped right there. And we're still trying to crack the biggest problem of all, which is Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell's unflinching defense of Aung San Suu Kyi, despite all evidence to the contrary, that she, in fact, is part of the problem, not part of the solution. And so on and on it goes. You know, for us, it's a constant push to spot opportunities, push for rights and justice, to build coalitions with the Rohingya and other international and national organizations working for justice, you know, to persuade policymakers to do something different, to advocate with this or that government or UN agency or multilateral organization to do what we want, and ultimately continue to push the boulder up the mountain, frankly, to finally get what we all need, which is justice for the Rohingya and the ability for them to return home in safety, in dignity, with protection and with rights. So to conclude, I would say that I'm motivated by a Thai labor movement saying, you know, having worked a lot with the Thai labor movement, which goes, "Got my boy, sue my toy," which basically translates as, we bite and we don't let go, we fight, we never retreat. Thanks.
Thank you, Phil. Good words to end on. You certainly pointed out the challenges, the huge challenges in terms of justice for the Rohingya, particularly when some, people areas, there's no acknowledgement or agreement on the extent of the abuse. And I suppose also it is, as technology moves on, it's very difficult to try and keep ahead of the Myanmar military, because we know they are very astute when it comes to technology and staying ahead of it. And I suppose some of it there ties in with Mike as well. We need first to have agreement on what justice is and what it requires. And I suppose that does take a lot of, as you say, actively working and collaboration together and working together as a group and working under some kind of agreement. And I suppose just like yourself working, as an activist for some time, and what I have come to find is that, to get people to activate people, they need to know the situation, but they also need to know that there is some hope. So certainly what you have pointed out there, you seem to be doing an incredible amount, but it is trying to get it out there. And of course, you're doing a lot of work behind the scenes anyway, but obviously The Guardian, the BBC, I noticed that a lot. You get a lot of coverage from Human Rights Watch gets a lot of coverage there. So it is very difficult in terms of, constructing the narrative. And this is the battle, it's the narrative. And if you have key players in America, honoring Aung San Suu Kyi, then, it's such an uphill battle. So I suppose it's getting the narrative changed and getting it out there,
The one thing I would add to that is I remember very clearly being a young staffer in Washington, D.C. in the early 1990s, when actually Mitch McConnell suddenly became very interested in Burma, and we all thought that that was a wonderful thing. And it was amazing that this very prominent person, who was the head of the Senate Appropriations Subcommittee on International Operations, really cared about this. And unfortunately, his views have not changed over the years. It's basically Aung San Suu Kyi or nothing, and it's unfortunate because he is now blocking all sorts of efforts to try to hold the Burmese government accountable.
Yeah, I agree. Thanks, Phil. The great contribution there. Azeem, Ibrahim, we're going to speak to you now. And it is on the international community. Of course, we have COVID-19 here, which is really important to include in terms of who's suffering the greatest, and how the international community, go back on, that's Bob's. It's a scholar on genocide who visited Arakan State, and we're asking you the question on how the international community can help in the fight for justice and to protect the victims of genocide. So sorry about that little error there, but Azeem, are you there?
Yep.
Great. Hi, Azeem.
How you doing? Thank you so much, Stephanie. And thank you so much to the European Rohingya Council for putting this event together. It's a great honor for me to be on this panel with my esteemed colleagues. I won't take up too much of your time. I just want to make three very quick points. The first point I'd like to make is that many of us, including most of us on this panel, have been involved in this issue for quite some time. Some of us for decades, in fact, have been researching and writing about the Rohingya issue with very little international kind of traction on this. And I can confidently say that at least a couple of years ago, if not about a year ago, most of us did not even know the difference. And in fact, this goes according to even to the general public, know the difference between the ICJ and the ICC. And there was a huge debate, even amongst scholars of genocide, even amongst activists and experts on the Rohingya. What exactly is the best recourse for the Rohingya? And everybody had come across the ICC because of the Yugoslav tribunals and the Milosevic trial and the Rwanda trial. And the ICJ was simply not considered. Most people had no idea what the ICJ was, and they confused it with the ICC. And I think that the fact that the Gambia has brought this case is obviously hugely welcome and is a huge testament to the Justice Minister of the Gambia, Minister Abu Becker. But at the same time, I think this calls for us to question our own country's many of them who are architects of this genocide convention, who are the architects of the ICJ, as to why did it take a tiny country like the Gambia, one of the smallest countries in Africa, to actually initiate this action when our own countries failed to do so. And I think this question has to be repeatedly asked until we get an answer from not just our elected representatives, but from our governments, is that when this avenue and this mechanism was always available, was always there to uphold the Genocide Convention, which countries like my country, the United Kingdom, actually wrote, had played a particular part in, why was this initiation, why was this not initiated by them? And I think this is a very important question. And I think the second part to that is that now that the Gambia has initiated this action, what will our countries, but we that live in the democratic societies, what action will our countries actually take to participate and support this? Will they join this action with the Gambia to uphold the Genocide Convention? Or will they support it verbally? Or what positions are they actually taking? Most of our countries are just completely silent. So I think that's probably one of the most important questions. And as we have seen in the situation in Myanmar, is that the Rohingya were not the first, were not just the first minority to be persecuted in this fashion. Myanmar is a country that has been at war with almost every ethnic minority since independence. These are the longest running civil wars in the world. The Rohingya simply just happened to be the first minority in which they were persecuted in this fashion. And now we see that the Myanmar authorities, the Myanmar military, the Tatmadaw, is using similar kind of tactics, similar kind of action against other minority groups. And many of them are simply motivated by the fact that they want to create a nationalist Burma Buddhist society that doesn't happen, that they just do not see many of these minorities being involved in. So I think these are very important questions that we have to ask our own representatives, and we have to continuously push this irrespective of what the Gambia and what the ICJ does, is that what does the Genocide Convention actually mean to many of our countries? The second point I would make is that I'm involved in a forum in Washington, DC called the Rohingya Legal Forum, which is a coalition of international lawyers and experts, some of whom have considerable experience working on cases like this, including people like Ambassador David Sherpa, who put together the Yugoslav Tribunal, and others from that worked on the cases in Syria, in Cambodia, and elsewhere. And there just seems to, even with my preliminary discussions with them, there just seems to be a lot of confusion in terms of the actual authority and power of the ICJ. And this actually resonates with my conversations with United Nations officials, even at the highest level, in terms of what power the ICJ actually has in terms of bringing Myanmar to account. We all know, we all understand the case that's in the court at the moment, under the Genocide Convention. But what actually happens if eventually, and I've heard a range of years here, from 2 to 3 to 5 to up to 15 years in terms of when the ICJ would actually rule on the issue of genocide. What power does it then have to actually enforce any action? What penalties can it inflict on Myanmar to actually make it comply? And there's a lot of confusion around that. Much of this is uncharted territory in international law. And as my understanding, that as long as China has a veto in the Security Council, there's actually very little enforcement action that the ICJ can actually take. So I think there's a lot more clarity actually required around that. And further to that, I would also say that, from the experts I've spoken to, and I'm not an international lawyer, the experts I've spoken to that have been involved in cases like this in the past have told me that this is probably one of the strongest cases that they have seen come in front of the International Court of Justice, the strongest cases of genocide. And so there is huge implications here for the ICJ and for international law in general, that if this case goes forward and this case is successful, what will be the implications if this case fails, if the ICJ fails to reach a conclusion of genocide, irrespective of how long that will take, 5 to 15 years or whatever. If the ICJ fails to come to the conclusion of genocide and actually enact penalties upon the architects and the perpetrators of the genocide, I believe that this will probably be the last case ever of genocide that we'll ever see. And this will essentially be an end to the international law and the Genocide Convention. I don't suspect that any other nation, any other people would want to bring a case to the ICJ if a case like of this strength and this caliber actually fails. So there are huge implications here in terms of the success of this case, and for other countries to actually get involved and support this case and to ensure that it reaches a successful conclusion and becomes a prototype in a model for other countries and for other people that are being persecuted in a similar fashion to follow. And one of my colleagues earlier touched upon the reporting mechanism. And this, to me, once again, not as an international lawyer, just seems to be an absolute anomaly in terms of international law and the ICJ situation. The fact that we have a situation now in which Myanmar has been given an order to report back to the ICJ. And essentially, this is the best way to describe it for non-lawyers. This is essentially like a caution. This is like a restraining order on Myanmar, and they have to report back to the ICJ, and only the ICJ and the Gambia have access to this report. And the fact that it is not being made public, I believe, is a complete anomaly, and this has to be corrected, you know, irrespective of how that is done. The fact that justice has to be done, but justice has to be seen to be done. And the fact that the Rohingya, which are the aggrieved party in this case, don't have access to this information, it just seems absolutely absurd. And this is the equivalent of you and I going to court under a particular charge, and the judges and the lawyers have a little discussion amongst themselves and come to a conclusion without you ever having access to any of the information or even being allowed to speak or participating in any of the hearings. This seems to be an absolute anomaly that has to be corrected. And the other thing I would say is that there's lots of emphasis clearly on this ICJ case, and that's rightly so. This case deserves a lot of attention. It deserves more attention, as I've said, and it deserves more pressure on our governments to get involved. And it deserves much more credit to the Gambia who have actually taken this forward. This is a huge and significant achievement by the Gambia, and huge from their determined efforts. But at the same time, we should not overemphasize in terms of the implications and the effects of this. You know, if you are a Rohingya refugee living in the camp in Bangladesh in Cox's Bazar, this case has absolutely no bearing on you whatsoever. You know, I'm absolutely certain, you know, with the internet being cut off, most of them have absolutely no idea what on earth is going on, or even understand the implications of this and how it affects their life. You know, most of them, if you look at theirs, if you put yourself in their shoes, they're living in these refugee camps without almost any hope. They are living in these camps without a nationality, without citizenship. They're living on handouts in mud and squalor in the largest refugee camp in the world. Many of them are trying to escape by boat and dying of starvation and thirst on these boats when countries are turning them back. And when you look at your children, the faces of your children, you know that the probability of your children growing up in these camps, living on handouts and as beggars, is probably quite high. This case has absolutely no bearing on them whatsoever and the quality of their lives. And I think, though it is very important to emphasize the ICJ case and put more effort into ensuring it gets much more traction, it's also important not to forget those individuals that are in the camps, and this case has absolutely no bearing on their life. And particularly with the COVID-19 issue taking up a lot of bandwidth in the international media, you know, it's very important that we continuously look and push solutions for the actual refugees in these camps, because we simply, even if the ICJ comes to a determination of genocide within the next few years, in the best case scenario, as Mike pointed out, you know, what does it mean for the 1 million refugees living in those camps and the millions of Rohingya that are living without citizenship, living as in squalor around the world? What would it mean for them? Will they be immediately returned to Myanmar? Even the probability of that, irrespective of what the court rules, is quite minimal. This is the most realistic situation. So we have to, at the same time, as push international community, push the United Nations and other global vehicles and our own governments, the government of Bangladesh and others, to try to look at much more effective and sustainable short-term solutions for those that are in the camps. That is essentially much more important over the long-term sustainability and the lives of the Rohingya than any other mechanism of international law that's happening that doesn't simply affect them, that they're simply not aware of, and that that has very little bearing on their lives. So, and the government of Bangladesh, as we have seen, and as Phil has pointed out, has tried a number of mechanisms to use the cover of the COVID-19 crisis to move some of these Rohingya onto unsustainable situations, like onto the Bhasan Char island, and stuff like this should not be permitted to pass without bringing scrutiny on the government of Bangladesh, who I have to say have to be congratulated and have to be lauded for the immense effort of taking on this burden. But at the same time, we in the international community have to put pressure on our own governments to try to find a much more sustainable solution for the Rohingya, because the situation at the moment, irrespective of which way this case goes, is simply not sustainable, and it's simply not a long-term solution. So I will just stop there, Stephanie, looking at the time.
Okay, Azeem, thank you. Yeah, quite stark, a lot of in what you've said, and perhaps, although I think I would argue with it in terms of it not making much difference to people in the camps. I think the diaspora, the Rohingya diaspora, it would make an enormous difference to know that, something may change for their families and friends in the camps left behind. And there is a trickle-down effect. It is traumatic for the Rohingya diaspora to have, been faced with daily visuals and reports coming out of the camps and coming out of Myanmar. So I think it's a really important thing for the diaspora and people working for the Rohingya to know that we can do something eventually. And even with Mike mentioning 2023, it's going to take an enormous effort by everybody in terms of supporting the Gambia and each of us. And as you say, you're talking about accountability there. You mentioned accountability. Really it is up to all of us to contact our TDs, our MPs, our statespeople, and ask, make sure that a question is tabled in our individual governments in terms of what is happening and what individual country stance is. So I think it's, again, the narrative, it's keeping it on the agenda. And of course, you talked about little international traction. I think myself in the last probably 5 years, there is a lot more international traction there. So that is good. And could I just ask, Azeem, your accent, you've taken me back. I've been taken aback. Is it West or East Coast Scotland?
It's from Glasgow. Yeah.
I thought it was Glasgow. Yeah, because you mentioned the situation a few times. So yeah. That's very Glaswegian. So I spent a good few years on the East Coast in Dundee. So I just love to hear the accent again.
Well, a lot of people confuse me with being Irish. I live in the US now, so
I was just taken aback, and I thought, gosh, I didn't expect that accent, because I didn't see anything at all on your bio or anything about Scotland. So you're keeping it very quiet, but the moment you open your mouth, you've given it away. So okay, well done. Thanks, Azeem. So Bob, you're sitting patiently. Well done. So there you're going to talk about the international community, COVID-19, justice for the Rohingya, and the safe return of the Rohingya to their ancestral land. So that's a tall order, I have to say. So off you go, Bob, and thank you. Just turn on your mic there, Bob.
I'll fire away. Thank you so much for inviting me to this conference, and it's great to be on a panel with so many very, very committed and very learned people, and I really appreciate the opportunity. I started working on this question in 2017 when Mr. Trudeau asked me to do a quick report for him before a summit meeting of Asian leaders in Da Nang, Vietnam. And I was able to get to the region and to get to the camp and give him a firsthand report of what I'd seen at the end of October in 2017. And since that time, I've spent a lot of time reading and learning and listening and trying to understand better the nature of the conflict that led to the genocide, to the forcible deportation of hundreds of thousands of people. And I can't claim that I'm an expert. I retain my political instincts and ways of looking at this challenge. And I think what I've heard today allows me to put some things in perspective. The first one is that not all justice happens in a courtroom. And I always said that I believe that the accountability mechanisms that Phil has described, which Canada frankly had quite a lot to do with as well. We played a very strong role in funding the IIMM, the mechanisms in Geneva. We were very strong advocates for it. I advocated for it in my report, which came out in April of 2018. And we've worked hard with the Gambia. I will at some point address the questions that have been raised about why the Gambia, because there is an answer to that question. It's not an accident that it's the Gambia leading the way. And I think now it's incumbent on other governments to indicate what they are going to do. And I know the Canadian government will be indicating that very soon. And we're working with other countries as well to see what more we can do to support the process at the International Court of Justice. And we were also very forcible advocates for the ICC jurisdiction issue. I raised that again in my report. And that is something I think that we've continued to believe is very important. My view is that we need to do everything we can to encourage the gathering of evidence. And I remind everybody that evidence is different than information. If you're going to go to a court, you need evidence, not just information. And that is critically important. And the gathering of evidence is still going on. There are still events taking place. There are still issues that are being raised. And I really appreciated Mike Becker's point about how the current situation in Rakhine, which is very bad, a great deal of violence, effectively armed combat going on between the Arakan army and the Tatmadaw, which is having a tremendous impact on the Rohingya and on everybody in terms of their vulnerability and their condition. The internet blackout, the lack of international access, only the WFP, the World Food Program, and the International Committee of the Red Cross have any significant degree of access, and their access is limited. And it's a constant struggle to get access to what's going on. And I, in terms of the COVID situation, yes, COVID is, and Professor McDermott, you don't have to convince me. I've been saying for some time that COVID is not a leveler. COVID is a revealer. COVID is not a leveler. It reveals the vulnerabilities, the inequalities, and the challenges that so many people face. Those who are poor are getting poorer. Those who thought they were well off are becoming poorer. So it is having a tremendous impact on revealing the vulnerabilities of different communities, particularly in this case, the Rohingya who are still living in Myanmar, and those who are now living in Bangladesh. So the quest for justice, which means the safe return with human rights, with mobility, with citizenship to Myanmar, is not something that is going to be achieved only by going to the ICJ. And we need to put that in perspective. The ICJ case is important. And, but for me, all of these court cases are in part about accountability of a state and the accountability of individuals. But they're also about creating the momentum and the pressure that will allow for a broader political resolution. So it is very important for us to go back to some basic principles. The first principle that I mentioned in my report, which the name was tell them we're human, is that the Rohingya are a people, and we need to listen to the voice of the Rohingya. The plight of the refugees is not going to be determined in Geneva or in New York or in The Hague. It's going to be determined on the ground in reaching a political settlement, which will involve the recognition of the rights of the Rohingya as a people who want to be citizens of Myanmar. And certainly every conversation I've had with a refugee, either in Sitwe, in the IDP camp where I met with people, or in Bangladesh in Cox's Bazar, to a person, they've all said, we want to go home, we want to have our rights, we want to be citizens of Myanmar. That is not going to be easy to achieve because it requires, as Phil has mentioned and everyone else has mentioned, it requires a political change inside Myanmar. And we're far from that today. Again, it's been mentioned. There is a military conflict in Chin State. There's a military conflict in Kachin State. There's a military conflict in Rakhine State. The Karen remain vulnerable. The Shan State remains vulnerable. There's much military conflict throughout Myanmar. And until we find a way to persuade the Bamar majority that it is in their interest to achieve a political settlement that will include the Rohingya, and until we persuade the other ethnicities in Myanmar that they must include the Rohingya in their struggle, that they must include them in their battles, it will be very difficult for us to succeed. I won't give you a history of all the court cases that have taken place that have not produced, have produced a result, and then the court had difficulty enforcing the judgment. I say to my American friends who are listening, think of the famous case of the Cherokee in Georgia in the 19th century, where Andrew Jackson famously said to Chief Justice Marshall, well, Judge, you've made your decision, now you have to enforce it. Enforcement requires a very effective mechanism and ultimately a political mechanism. And it's already been mentioned about the position of the Chinese in the Security Council, the position the Russians have taken in the Security Council. It has made it very, very difficult for the Security Council to have any significant role in dealing with the situation of the Rohingya. A bit of a role, but not as much of a role as I think everyone would like to see. And we have to find other ways and mechanisms. And it will require governments of all kinds in Asia and around the world to become more involved in trying to persuade and not just persuade, but to do everything we can to get a political solution on the table. Because I fundamentally believe that the social justice that we're looking at requires a greater recognition that it's not just the legal routes we have to take, it's also important for us to look at the political ways in which we need to engage and effect change. And I can assure you that that's a lot of what Canada has been doing. And yes, a lot of it has been behind the scenes, but it's been very clear to everybody who's been involved and listening to us that these are things that we believe need to happen, but it's going to take a more effective engagement with a number of countries for that to happen. And I certainly agree that we need to combine governments and NGOs and international agencies working together in a joined up way. It is going to take a lot of effort for us to be able to support the Rohingya in their political evolution, in the personality that they develop internationally as a political community. And it requires a tremendous amount of joined up effort. And I would observe from my work in Canada that even getting the Canadian government to work in a joined up way is not easy. It's difficult, it's challenging. But public opinion in part has forced the Canadian government to do more. And that I think has been a very healthy sign. And we can encourage other governments to do the same. It's also important, and Dr. Ibrahim referred to this, I think he's absolutely right, that we need to focus on improving the short-term, medium-term living conditions in the camp in Bangladesh. Canada has been arguing very strongly with the government of Bangladesh. We've never been in favor of the Bas-en-Shar solution. We don't think that's a solution. We've argued very strongly that the internet should be restored to the camp, that we have to recognize that there will not be a short-term return to Myanmar without political change in Myanmar, and that the idea that you can simply send people back to where they were before, when all their villages have been either destroyed or completely changed, when many people are occupying the land which they previously occupied, when they effectively have no protection, unless those measures are taken inside Myanmar, unless there is a clear recognition of the rights of the Rohingya people as a people within the country of Myanmar, there is no point in talking about a return. A return would only create more conditions that would lead to yet another forcible deportation. We need to get to the roots of the conflict inside Myanmar. And as that is happening, we need to do everything we can to make sure that the conditions in the camp are tolerable, are livable, and that there are ways for Rohingya in Bangladesh to make a living, and that there are ways for them to get an education for their children. And these are critical rights which we need to establish within the camps themselves. And so far we're not there. And we made a bit of progress with the Bangladeshis before COVID on the question of education. But now that the internet has been taken away, I mean, you can't have effective education inside the camps without access to the internet. It's just a simple reality. And if the arguments that I hear people sometimes make, to say, well, there's a very serious security situation, so we have to clamp down. And my argument in reply is there's a very serious security situation, yes, but you have to provide people with hope. You have to provide people with a reason to engage constructively, and not to take the crazy, in my opinion, notion that somehow a trafficker can come along and say, well, we'll put you on a boat and get you somewhere better and pay me a ton of money and I'll make sure it happens. And we've all seen the disaster on the Andaman Sea this spring, and we don't want to keep seeing that happen because it's false hope. We want to provide people with real practical hope where they are. There's no point in abandoning the objective of achieving a political settlement. We should not be abandoning that direction, but we should be doing everything we can to improve the conditions of the people who are living in the camps today. And I just want to say that I am concerned that in the pursuit of accountability and in the pursuit of international justice, which I favor and the government of Canada favors, we not recognize that whenever and I'm a lawyer, and I always advise clients, you can go to court, but you've got to understand that you go to court and you either win or lose. And if you lose, you lose, and if you win, you win. And I don't want to pretend that there is absolute and complete certainty in the nature of a result that we will get from any court, particularly international courts, where the processes, as Professor Becker has pointed out, are long and slow and complex, and where the issue of enforcement of the judgments is not entirely clear or self-evident, because there's always going to be a political element in the enforcement of a court judgment, and that is something that we have to recognize. So my view is there is hope in the struggle. But I think it's very important that we provide people with a sense of a willingness to partner, a willingness to fight, a willingness to continue to engage, to support those cases that are going forward, and to do everything we can to see that other governments do the same. And Canada is committed to doing that. But we're also committed to not just promising justice in the hereafter, but promising that we're going to try and take some important steps to improve the human condition of the Rohingya today, not forever far away, but today. And I think that's a very important balance that we need to strike in looking at how we can affect justice. The politician in me, which is not entirely dead, the politician in me says there's lots of ways to achieve justice, and we should not ignore the role that politics and international politics has to play in achieving justice for the Rohingya. It isn't simply going to be by going to court, although going to court will help us in the struggle overall. We have to see it in that context. And I appreciate very much the opportunity to be with everyone. And it's a pleasure to be able to join you this morning from my cabin in Canada. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. Like you say, Canada has played a very strong role in advocating for the rights of Rohingya. Indeed, I've met John Packer on a few occasions, and he there is working tirelessly as well on behalf of the Rohingya. Accountability, you've mentioned, pressure, all of that, but I particularly like that, you know, and totally in agreement with you here, that you have to provide hope, you know, and you are right, not all justice happens in a courtroom, but it does validate the efforts by people, and that's really important to have that recognized in law and in policy. So it is difficult, also other ethnicities in Myanmar to join with the Rohingya in terms of fighting the fight. You know, they're very dispirited groups, if you like. It's very, very difficult when people are so oppressed to kind of join others when they're so immersed in their own troubles. So it's a very, very difficult one, which we've seen that all over the world. And of course, the roots of the conflict, very, very important. I mean, we're not going to understand, you know, what's happening in America unless we know the roots of the history of slavery, all of that. So it's really, really important that we look at the whole context of what has happened in the past for any conflict. And, you know, once we look at the roots, we tend to understand at least a little bit more of how we have arrived at where we're at. But until people recognize that injustices have been done to people, and that is why sometimes they act the way they do. So it's really, really important for that. So I'm going to open it now. So I guess you can all unmute there to discuss, or if anybody wants to ask each other questions. There are no questions. I don't see any questions coming in on the chat there. So I'm not sure if that has been opened by the ERC. I only have one question there about the volume, but I think perhaps it might be an opportunity, given that there's no questions in here yet, that for you to maybe ask each other questions, and perhaps just in terms of a way forward here. So if anyone wants to go first, you can raise your hand.
I was gonna say something. Actually, it's particularly relevant to what Bob was discussing, which is the idea of like sort of creating, in recognizing that you have to have international pressure to create momentum for some sort of political settlement or something to happen. And I think that what we're seeing, you know, I mean, the courts are bringing pressure, you know, the ICJ, the ICC, if it does decide to go forward with charging individual members of the Tatmadaw or others, you know, we don't know yet what the ICC is going to do. It hasn't been really sort of saying very clearly what's going on. You know, there's also the case, possible case in Argentina, which the former SR has been involved in, dealing with universal jurisdiction. All these things are about building pressure. But what I would say, and this goes back to another case that I was involved with, and this goes back to the 1990s and 2000, which is the whole effort to get the then SBDC and Tatmadaw to stop using forced labor. And there was a whole campaign around the issue of Myanmar's ratification of ILO Convention 29, its obligations to the ILO, and, you know, a continued ramping up of pressure, more information being brought. And it finally, we finally saw a real end to the use of forced labor in many places in Myanmar, particularly because finally it got to the point where the ILO was about to take Myanmar to the International Court of Justice for failing to comply with its obligations under ILO Convention 29. And, you know, I mean, it was something that the Myanmar military didn't want to change. They were using forced labor as an operational part of the way they, you know, worked in ethnic areas, attacking ethnic insurgencies, you know, whether it be the Karen or the Karenni or the Mon, Shan or the others. All these areas were places where there were significant amounts of forced labor, including also the Chin, Kachin states and other places. But, you know, it was basically a 10-year campaign to create enough pressure finally that the military government of Myanmar had to buckle, and they were afraid of the International Court of Justice, and that was the final straw that broke the camel's back. So, you know, how can we then continue to escalate the campaign both legally and politically so that we actually get to a point where the Myanmar government realizes they have to change policy and they have to allow the Rohingya back, and they have to provide the various guarantees, citizenship and protection for human rights, these other things that we have been demanding all along.
Well, I think you build it politically, Phil. I mean, I think that's what we have to do. We have to work together to build that campaign involving, as I said, I think it involves NGOs and international organizations, and it also involves governments. And we need to be sharing information more aggressively. We need to be using both publicity and, you know, the backroom channels that governments use and diplomats use. We have to have a broad strategy. And I think one of the important parts of it for me is really allowing the Rohingya themselves to be part of this strategy, to be part of how we achieve, how we reach out, encourage reaching out inside Myanmar, encourage dialogue inside Myanmar between different ethnic groups and ethnic leaders, encourage that process of discussion, which has to take place before we're going to get the kind of political change that is required. I did some work previously with the Forum of Federations, which was a forum of federal countries that tries to support the principles of pluralism in a number of places around the world. And the challenge is we really have to get the other groups in Myanmar to embrace the Rohingya as part of the family, because the lack of that, the absence of that, has allowed for the isolation and victimization of the Rohingya. That is not, you know, we have to create the base for that, and that is going to be a real challenge. And but I think it can be done. I don't think it's impossible. I think it can be done.
Could I just maybe ask Law, could you make some comment on that in terms of the Rohingya groups working together and how that might even be workable? Yeah.
Yes, we as a community, as the activists, all feel that it is very, very important because international community or activists, scholars, individual states can support to the Rohingya by themselves should move forward. So we feel that as an organization, as an individual activist, but we need also to be organized to be working together. We need to learn also, we need support from our friends, scholars, also like NGOs. This is very important. And secondly, because of the genocidal policies on Rohingya community, the policy affects each and everyone, whether educated or not educated or activists. It affects the psyche of Rohingya community. It's very difficult sometimes. Actually, sometimes when non-Rohingya observes Rohingya community, it seems a little bit like there is some disunity or some there's lack of working together, coordination. Yes, it is true, but this is because of the genocidal policy affecting all of us in deep down to our psyche. So to come out of this, we need also support from our friends, from especially like our honorable speakers, also the NGOs who are working for the interests of the Rohingya community. Yes.
Can I just interject there, Stephanie? And I think what Phil and Bob, the points they made, very important points in terms of trying to build an international coalition on the political level, not just the legal. I think one of the difficulties we've had, and this is a problem that is still happening. You know, I've had conversations with policymakers from around the globe, and to this day, many of them are still reluctant to get involved in this or take a position because they still put so much currency in Aung San Suu Kyi and the fact that she is going to bring the change. And many of them believe that, you know, she's being held hostage by the military and she's being forced into this action, or that she's not aware, she's not being fed the correct information. And they should have been disabused of this when she appeared in front of the ICJ herself in person and made the case that, and if you remember, their defense was that, look, genocide has not occurred, but war crimes have. So under the Genocide Convention, you cannot hold us to account, but certainly we accept that war crimes have occurred. And I've met with the people that have actually went to Myanmar to meet with her, and I've come away completely bamboozled, simply because she is extremely articulate. You know, she went to Oxford, she's a Nobel laureate, she speaks very softly, and she comes away saying, well, look, these are really complicated problems that have been with us for decades, the suspicion and difficulty on both sides, and I'm doing whatever I can, etc., etc. And they come away because they're not fully aware of the situation, they've not been fully briefed. They come away believing that, well, look, she's doing whatever she can. And I think until the international community can be disabused of the fact that she is going to bring any sort of change, then I think we're going to be in the same position as the earlier speakers have said, as Mitch McConnell, who's just an obstacle. You know, I've had meetings with policymakers in the US, UK, and most recently, and I'm happy to say this on record, even the Consul General here in Chicago, the Japanese Consul General in Chicago, who told me in no uncertain terms that, look, this isn't a big issue of the Rohingya being persecuted, and Aung San Suu Kyi is the one that's going to take the country forward and correct all these errors. So until we can make the point that no change is going to come with her at the helm, I think you're going to have real difficulty in bringing this together, this political coalition.
Ambia, could I ask you perhaps to make a comment?
Okay. The thing is, Assalamu alaikum. Hi, everyone. I really appreciate ERC and the Rohingya people, appreciate all the speakers, and then the ERC to make it this online after the COVID-19 or during the COVID-19 crisis, and also the people, the audience who are watching us. I really thank you people for giving us time and giving, making a thought of it, how we can solve, how we can do, and where we can go. I have been constantly repeating, and this is also the ERC is constantly repeating that, you know, our Rohingya crisis is no more a regional crisis, it's no more a regional security or the threats. It has become a global crisis, and it might take further, and not that at the end of the day, people will not stand for the Rohingya and will accept that Rohingya has been going through the genocide. And maybe this genocide will come to a completion of a phase, because so far right now, no community has been fully went through the genocide. But Rohingya might be, because we are only worldwide 3.1 million Rohingyas are there, and then inside the camp it's almost like 400 to 600 Rohingyas are still living over there. And you know, if we don't take the fastest measures to protect those vulnerables, the genocide might happen with Rohingyas. And secondly, as I really like the main point Mr. Bob Ray, Honorable Bob Ray had made, that this is, no matter what the ICJ, ICC, and the jurisdiction, they can give us the justice, but they will not be able to give us the political rights. Unless the political rights is not given to us, it will not be the Rohingyas will be still keep on continuing suffering those atrocities. So it is very important that the international community and the Rohingyas and the superpower countries like Canada, America, UK, that they force the Burma, the Myanmar government to change those laws and policies which are still constantly available or practicing in their constitution against the ethnic minorities. As we have just discussed today, it is not only the Rohingya who are suffering with these things, but there are other ethnic minorities. And then you know, and then to maintain those sustainable normal living for the camps in the refugee camp, it's not I mean, I see this my view, that these Rohingyas people who fled in the last still keep on fleeing. You know, the situation is not improving inside the camp, and the situation is also not improving inside the Arakan. And you know, we are being, yes, the people living in the camp, they are out of fear maybe, but they have no hope. They don't know what is right. They don't know what is wrong. They are completely in daily stress factors. Not only they are getting their rights, but they are also a lack of humanitarian access inside the camp also. And then people, we are talking about the hope. How can you give them a hope when they don't have when they don't have the internet access? They don't know what's really going on with ICJ. They don't know what is the ICC is going on. They don't know what is, what do you say, with the jurisdiction is going on, because they have no idea. Whatever we are trying to give them, the information through the other sources, they are getting. So internet is very, very important. And besides that, as you people, especially Mr. Honorable Bob Ray has said, that it is very important, the education. I mean, we are fed up with the food, we are given the shelters over there, but we don't know how to use our pen. We don't know how to, even if we get the justice today or tomorrow, how to enjoy it, how to fight for our rights. So it is very important that these people living in the camp, they get the fully basic rights also, which they were like in Myanmar. And the Myanmar, inside the Myanmar, those vulnerable 400 to 600 people living over there, we have no idea what is going on. The genocide is still going on, because every day our people are killed. Every day there are no basic humanitarian assets are there, and there is no education there. The restrictions still over there, and the fight is going on there. There is black out of the internet. We really, Rohingyas in diaspora, we don't know how to move forward. Yes, it is true that I have heard so many things over there, but how we can make it to practical? Okay, and now if you talk with the governments, they have their own strategy. You know, they have their own economic, geographical interest. They don't want to come across with the extra humanity or with the rights or justice. You know, they listen to us, but at the end of the day, they do what is in their best interest.
Mm-hmm. I understand.
And you know, we Rohingyas in diaspora also, we are we are talking about the hope. It's very nice word, 3 words, 4 alphabets, HOPE. But we really don't know how to make these hopes, because we are hearing it will take like long years with the ICJ, it will take with the ICC long years, and then our people are still fleeing, our people are still raped, our people are still dying, and then there is no humanitarian access available, also in the camp also. How we can build hope in those constant fearing in humanitarian conditions.
Mm-hmm. I understand, Ambia. And what I'd like, could you maybe say a few words on, obviously this whole crisis is very gendered in terms of, the hierarchy of who suffers most. And we know that there are huge problems in terms of what women are doing in the camps and how much they hold. And I know you have worked on some programs. So could you maybe just give us a little bit in terms of the gender dimension to the suffering in the camp?
All these, we know that 2017, when this in August 25th, 65% people were the women and the orphans. These are the women who have really lost their male gender. They have no husbands, majority of them. They have no father, they have no brother. They came up with many children, and then coming over here, where we in our society, where unfortunately it's also because of our brother said, Dr. Lacho, that we have been built from the day of our birth as abnormal because of the genocide we were going through. How can you build a normal development when you are, from the day of your existence, you were suppressed by your country, that you were made stateless. So our people, the male genders, they have the same, the consequences of the genocide. They have come has been continuing in the camp, and it is very difficult for them to understand or to give the rights to the women. And our women, majority of them are there, and then it is so difficult for them in those areas to live a normal human life, not as a woman. It is already a difficult because of the of the male
absence.
Then with the other problems, our women are not learned with those things, how to live in those situations. That's why I have never heard, I'm sorry to say that, I've never heard in my whole life of this age, that Rohingya, we were never against prostitution, but Rohingya women and children or girls will go to that profession. It is all because we were not prepared, and nobody is taking care of us well.
Yes.
The things are getting worse and worse and worse. And then what I'm trying to say is that repatriation will take time. Yes, and the ICJ, ICC will take times, but why we cannot give to these people education? Now we have seen with the COVID-19 crisis that people don't need to go to outside the camp to study, to have the formal education, which can be done online. So provide us the education so that our every woman, every child, every other people can not only get the education, but will also be aware of what is actually going on with the Rohingya plight. And where are we standing today? What are the functions they need to do? How we can only give information. The evidences can be collected only when we have the internet access. Before, in 2012, 2013, 16, 17, why people were able to give us those evidences? Because the internet was there. Now the Burmese government have came to know that these that due to the internet access, the Rohingyas inside the Arakan could give us the evidences through the internet. That's why they have blacked out all those things. And what I wanted to say also to all the speakers, my question is now the day before yesterday, the election committee of Myanmar has said that that the election will come up in November 2020. The date is not fixed, so it means the repatriation will not come over again in 2 months. The election committee will be working on the elections and all those, and then in November, now before in 2015, NLD was 80% won this election. Now there is that it might not be the NLD will win the election, and it might be the army against USDP, or there will be a coalition of these things. So the repatriation and the political rights that we are seeking for, it will happen after the election. My question to all the panelists, that what are we doing for this election? Because in 2015, though they say it was free and fair election, which was not, because forget about the Rohingyas, none of the Muslims were not to be a part of the election or to vote their own MPs and all those. So what are the things that for example, Canada, the Ireland, from USA and the other countries are taking part to persuade that this should be, it cannot be a democratic when the other ethnic minorities cannot take the vote to right.
Sorry, Ambia, I have to cut in here. We're hearing from the ERC that we have, I think, 3 minutes left, but I thought we were going to 4:10, so he's just going to check on that. Could I just address, first of all, there are 300 people watching, so thank you for taking the time this afternoon for watching. There's one question here. Someone is asking, is Aung San Suu Kyi afraid of the Myanmar military? Does someone want to take that? Because I think it is, there is some narrative out there that she is a puppet and that she is afraid herself of the Myanmar military. Phil, will you take that very quickly?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't call her scared of the military. I would say that she somehow thinks she can do a deal with them. And in fact, the reality is that she gave away much of her leverage right at the start of this whole political process back in 2013, 2014, when she told all the various different countries around the world, lift sanctions and do business as usual because everything's going to be fine. She doesn't necessarily have the leverage, and she doesn't have the votes given the 2008 Constitution to change the Constitution. I think what's going to happen, she's decided that she doesn't want to have a fight with the military over the Rohingya. She is basically discarding Rohingya, the Kaman Muslims, and the Burman Muslims, across the country. She's just basically saying, I'm not gonna deal with that. She's decided that's a political loser for her in the 2020 election, and unfortunately, I think she's decided in some ways to be an accomplice to the military.
That is the general feeling.
It would have been the easiest thing in the world for her to basically say, when the situation started in 2016, she could have said to the Human Rights Council and to others, she could have said, look, I'm the foreign minister. I will allow you into the country and give you a visa to come into the country. But, I don't have the power to allow you to go into security controlled areas because that's in the Constitution under the military. And that you have to go talk to the military about that. And the entire spotlight of the international community and all the pressure would have moved from her to where it properly belongs, was the military. And she didn't do that. I just don't think that she's very astute politically in terms of understanding the strategy. There may be other issues also related to her own personality, her arrogance, that's just other things like that. But the reality is that I don't think that she's beholden to the military, but I don't think she's got a solution for the military either. And she's going to go into this election and probably end up in a weaker place than she is currently now, in terms of majority in the parliament.
Yeah, well, as Azeem said earlier, she's an extremely articulated person, and she has many admirers still. I want to return to Ambia there in terms of because you had a very important question, and I'm also conscious of the time here, but I also, at the start of this, I was very keen that we have some kind of actions on this. Now I see that the internet access has come up, and it is very important that something is done about that. So I suppose the first action would be that we as a group try to make some noise about that. Now, whether it's one of the things, whether it's we all go through the ERC, because again, if we can all work together, it will be a stronger voice than individual organizations. So certainly Rohingya Action Ireland will go through the ERC, which is good. So maybe there is a bit of discussion out there in terms of what platform we are using, because the stronger the platform and the more voices on that platform, I think that's probably going to make a difference. Not much of a difference, but I think it'll be a louder voice, because we have, again, you talked to Ambia, you mentioned the bigger nations, you have America, Canada, a lot of the European countries, the UK, and it is really up to someone in those countries, and this is ourselves, to get in touch with our elected representatives. And this is what we need to put out there. And to all the people who are listening, politicians are representing us. They're our elected representatives, and we need to put pressure on them. So we need to, to write, to get in touch with them. Social media is a very good platform. So I'm advocating that for the ERC, that have done huge work, and I'm very conscious of Ambia and, Rafiq and Heikel and all of the families in Carlo that are traumatized almost every day in terms of their people and their families. And what they're going through. So, it is important that we at least some of our organizations were one step removed from that. So I think we should be able to carry that load a little bit when some of the atrocities are very clearly happening. So Ambia, could you just reiterate your question there, please?
My question is right now, I have noticed that the international community always say that, we would like to give you rights, and this issue should be brought to the UN security, but because of the China and because of the Russia, we cannot move forward. On the other side, they will say, that because of the Aung San Suu Kyi, she is a puppet, the army is very strong, it's very difficult for us to go inside. So, the expertise of dealing with the UN security, and also with Myanmar, who made Aung San Suu Kyi, who made the Aung San Suu Kyi icon of the humanitarian or humanity. We are the ones, the Western world is the one who made them, and it was the sanctions were dropped out in 2012 from this country, so the sanctions can be put back also. And why people cannot, if you can make the person icon, you should be able to also understand her and get the way how to that whatever is in her presence is going on and in the name of the democracy, which is wrong. If the international community wants to help us, it is not only helping the Rohingya, we are talking about the genocide in our presence in this civilized century, 21st century. If this genocide happens and it occurred completely, who are responsible for it? I see, though I'm a small women, but I see that the international community can do more to pressure the Myanmar, to pressure Aung San Suu Kyi, and also to bring this cause to the UN Security Council. We need to pressurize more, and the sanctions will do a lot, because the Myanmar government, we are dealing with not with the normal military people. We are dealing with the very smartest military of Myanmar, who has been conquering the country, who has been making the rule and divide law and enjoying their things. You can see it with the ICJ provisional measurements. They did not change. Yes, I understand that Mr. Becker has said that these things are that we should not see it that nothing has changed, but something has changed. But what do you mean by massive killings? Should not happen massive killings. They are only left over here 400 and 600 Rohingyas living. Every day 2 to 3 people are died. In 10 years there are no more 400 those Rohingyas available there, or no more living over there.
Okay, thanks, Ambia. We have 4 minutes left. There's a question coming from Christine Fries, and it relates to, Ambia, what you were saying, and that is, how can the living situation in Cox's Bazar be improved? Like, what can we do now in terms of the living situation in Cox's Bazar? I mean, we need the internet coverage, but is it finance? Is it what is it?
The internet coverage.
It's all of the above. It's all of the above.
Okay.
Just to be clear,
Okay.
it's the financial support for which is critical, and this is a great challenge. It's allowing for international access. Again, many of the agencies have pulled back during COVID-19. And we need to work with, make sure that that happens. And we've said it over and over again, needs to be said again. Let's remember, there's no internet in Cox's Bazar in the camps right now. It's not just in Northern Rakhine. It's not just in Rakhine State. So we have to work with the government of Bangladesh to say, we need more access and we must have internet access in order to allow the camp to become a livable place. And we need more international support for what's going on inside the country.
Yeah, I mean, the various different funding appeals need to be fully funded. I mean, every time the UN agencies, others come up with a plan, they put it out there for funding, get like 30% of what they need. You know, it's ridiculous. The other aspect of it is that there needs to be a change of Bangladesh policy. Bangladesh is still holding on to this fiction that these people are suddenly going to be picking up and leaving from there in another 6 months or a year. That's just not the case. You know, the reality is that there are no hard structures in the camps beyond, you know, a few mosques and other things like that. I mean, if we had a typhoon come in straight over the camp, it would be a disaster. There is no evacuation plan. So the reality is that they have to understand that there has to be internet, there has to be adequate supply, there needs to be adequate infrastructure, including hardened buildings. There has to be education. There has to be all these things. They have to recognize that this is going to take a while. The international community has to commit also to Bangladesh that they are not going to rest until these people are allowed to go home to Myanmar. That's what Bangladesh is worried about, is they're worried about getting stuck with 1 million people for 10, 20, 30 years.
Yeah, it's a very tricky one, isn't it? Because on the one hand, Bangladesh thinks they're doing a wonderful, you know, offering shelter. But on the other hand, you know, they don't really have a handle on what's going on. I'm just wondering, okay, last one question. And Ambia, you have to come in with closing remarks. But before we're cut off, a question here from Mike. You know, what will the outcome of the ICJ, whether it be positive or negative, is that going to make a huge impact on the ordinary Rohingya? I mean, I think that was kind of answered in terms of, you know, Azeem said no. It is very difficult for the ordinary Rohingya. If you're talking about the Rohingya in the camps, you know, the difference it will make is minimal, but for the diaspora, the trickle down. But Mike, do you want to say something about that very quickly?
Yeah, very briefly. I mean, I think it goes to what Bob Ray said, which I agreed with entirely, that all of these legal strategies or tactics are based on creating the political pressure to get to a political settlement. So I wouldn't say the ICJ case holds no hope for having an impact on the lives of those who've been forced to flee if it ultimately helps lead to the situation that allows for their return. But that's, you know, the timeline on that is long, and we've been talking about the need for immediate help. The one thing I'd say is, you know, I think this goes to a point Azeem made about, will other states want to get involved, or why aren't we asking why other states don't get involved? Because there is a mechanism by which states could intervene in the case. And I've been very skeptical about that because legally speaking, it's kind of a mixed bag. If you come in to repeat the same arguments that Gambia is making, it doesn't add much. Whether it adds politically, whether it puts more pressure on Myanmar in terms of the optics, that's a different thing. But what I would ask those states who are seriously thinking about coming in, I mean, Maldives has already said they plan to come in. I would ask whether their resources would be better placed towards trying to address some of the immediate material needs of those in the camps right now, rather than coming in to kind of offer moral support to the Gambia, which is a noble gesture, but maybe isn't where resources are most needed right now. Needed
just in the immediate. Okay, thanks, Mike. Ambia, you have a few moments there on closing remarks. So I'm hoping that Ibrahim doesn't just cut us off, but just in case he does, because we only have so much time, I want to thank you all for your contributions. Really, really interesting. Yeah, I said it's okay to ask one. Really interesting, and I think a lot has come out of it. We haven't reached what I wanted to reach in terms of outcomes, but I think maybe if we all can communicate on the ERC platform in terms of what we can do and what we are doing, and perhaps, you know, sign the same letters or whatever, but I think that's as much as we can do for the moment. And I do think there is hope, and the fact that we've had this meeting this afternoon would certainly indicate that there is a lot of interest there. There is a lot of hope It's very complex, it's very complicated, but not either. In some ways, it's political as well. So Ambia, would you like to conclude, please?
Yes, I really wanted to thank again the speakers, the ERC, and the audience watching over there. We, the Rohingya, are very thankful to the international community. Whatever you people are doing for us, I think we should not have stand so far, because we were born, but we were really not. We were born, but we had no idea what is the right, what is the basic right of the human being, what are the things that we can go to bring us justice. So these things were made possible because of your stands. And we also thank the government of Bangladesh for taking care of us from 1978 by every time repatriation, coming back, going back, but they have been taking a lot of burden, because we see that, you know, when I visited in last year, the Bangladesh, I have seen that the community itself, they are more poor than the Rohingyas living inside the camp. But nevertheless, it's very important that the international community support and appreciates Bangladesh. It is also very important that the legal actions should be taken for the ICJ, ICC, and the jurisdiction. On the other side, as we have mentioned, it is very important to pressurize the government of Myanmar, and also to see the political rights. We need to get our political rights, because, and how we can get the political rights is very important for the governments, for the NGOs, for the individuals, to see, to go the root causes, the root cause of this Rohingya plight, you name it, as ethnic cleansing, genocide. Without the root cause, you will not be able to understand our plight. We were the Rohingyas who were living in 1824, first time when the British people occupied the Burma. From those days, prior to that, we Rohingyas were living. We were enjoying to how to vote, to select our nominate our MPs. There were freedom. We were the citizen, full citizenship rights we were enjoying till 1982 or 1962 till 82, when they have stripped up our basic rights and our citizenship rights. This cannot happen, which is really, this 1982 law should be amended from this constitution. Without that, even if we live in Bangladesh and wait for the ICJ, wait for the ICC, wait for the jurisdiction, and the repatriation occurs in one day, today or tomorrow, and going back to the country. But without our political rights, this will be a curse circle, going back, coming back, and all that. So that's why it's very important. The international community can do a lot. They have done a lot, but they can do a lot, and to pressurize the government. And then not only, now I see that there will be no changes will be made till the election. So the international community should know, if they want to see the real democracy in Myanmar, what are the things they can do right now? And maybe on that basis, whoever is elected, and they will see, okay, this is not the right thing that we are doing. After the election, they might change the policy. So far, we have to wait. Another thing is that till we wait for our justice, our political rights also, it's very important. Please make sure that you only not feed us, make sure not only that you give us water, not only that you give us shelter. Please educate us. Without that, having the political rights and getting the justice, we will not be able to enjoy it, because we will be mentally, medically, and as a human being, we will not enjoy those things if we have no idea how to enjoy it. And that can be only happen with the education. And there are a lot of youth generations are living over there who has no hope, and the education is the only tool to fight further for our rights, and is the only tool that we can sustain our normal life in the camps or outside the camps. Thank you.
Thank you. Am I still on? Yeah, thank you very much, Ambia. And again, I'm going to close it off now because the Ibrahim Mohammed ERC needs to make a press release, so he has to get working on that. Law, do you want to say anything as chairman of the ERC, just the last word? And thank you for organizing the event.
I really want to thank again, and I want to say this: we will be continuously knocking the door of yours and others until we reach our goal, until we get justice, until we reach our homeland with safety and dignity. So please, whenever we knock the door, please welcome us. This is what I want to say. Thank you so much.
We'll have the doors open, I'm sure, social distancing. And again, thanks to the ERC and to the Rohingya medics for all of the work. I've noticed all of the notices they have put up and on any of the social media, wonderful. So all of the work to the Rohingya medics as well. So thank you very much. It's been a bit of a marathon session, but well done everyone. And please, if we can keep in contact, we have each other's email addresses and see what we can do from here. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, and we will send you the draft to every speaker, and later we will release when we reach the finals, and we will release. It's okay.
Thank you, Ibrahim. Okay.
People, the other Rohingya people are online. They're watching. They're appreciating everyone. They thank you every speaker, and they listen very carefully, and they're sharing a lot of their word praise.
Thank you very much. It's a great opportunity to join you. Thank you so much.
It's great.
It was a great privilege.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. We'll be in touch.
Bye.
See you, Phil. Ike, Azeem. Yeah.
Yes.
Great. Okay, I'm going to leave now too. Okay, Ibrahim, thank you. If you need any editing on that, editing on the release.
Actually, our team will be drafting and send you before we release. So if we finally reach, then we'll be released.
No problem.
And I hope we will be talking next conference. You'll be continue with us.
I'd love to. It would be a pleasure.
Yeah, wonderful job. You did a wonderful job. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for asking. I was reluctant in the beginning, but I'm happy that something is happening, you know, but I think we really have to push on the internet access because that affects education. And I think we can all, you know, I'm very much a believer in the grassroots. So, you know, if we vote people in, they are accountable. So we need to, you know, make them act accountable